Now, today when I picked up John Keith, he says to me that he had trouble sleeping last night. He's going to have a hard time getting through today. And then Terry Jones told me, you know, I was up late last night. I'm going to have a hard time today. And then Gene comes up and says, talk loud. I got up at 4. A pattern emerges. I don't think I've ever met so many people that came to one place planning on sleeping before. It makes me wonder how many of the rest of you are in that same condition. How many brought pillows? Genesis chapters 1 through 11, the topic of our lecture series this year. To say that it is the subject of disbelief and skepticism, I think, is to state what surely must be painfully obvious. I would suppose, and I think I would make this argument, that of the most disputed facts of the Bible, of the three, I would count probably the creation in Genesis, the flood, and the resurrection, and two of those are found here in this section of the Bible. Now, it is disputed, and for those of us, most of whom, even across the board, not just members of the church, but the public that once had a fairly deep-seated trust in the Bible, we've learned to kind of brace ourselves for a constant assault. You see, every time that a topic on the Bible in general comes up in public, that is, when it's being presented through some media, whether you're talking radio, television, or the AP or anything like that, they go out and they find experts. The problem is, those experts are every time, not some of the time, every single time, the expert is somebody that you and I would characterize as a left-wing kook. But his pronouncements are accepted as gospel. And the irony is intended because he doesn't accept the gospel. Well, I guess you could say that's the situation, but you know, brace yourself, it gets worse. At this point, the assault gets so far as to make this kind of a charge that all of the learned scholars agree with this viewpoint. And so, if you don't agree with that viewpoint, well, obviously, you're not one of the learned scholars, which is what is sometimes called the emperor's new clothes approach. And it has proved very effective. I think there are 3 principles that drive it. I want to cover those with you quickly. Principle number 1 is, in fact, what is usually discussed in a different context, that being a political one. It's what we call the politically correct movement. That's one of the reasons. You know, I'm old enough to remember this. It doesn't seem like anybody else in the country does, but I do. I remember over 20 years ago, the first time I heard the phrase politically correct. It didn't mean what it means now. Today it means careful with what you say. It didn't mean that then. Today it's used by critics of it. I'm here to tell you, I remember when those who were politically correct wore it as a badge of honor. And what they meant by it at the time was this. Here are a set of orthodoxies that are so true, so set in stone, that anybody who disagrees with them is obviously, hopefully, ignorant or dishonest. These included such things as women's liberation, gay rights, such things as that. And the door was closed, the discussion was over, and our opponents of ourselves, our anointed selves, who are not politically correct, are not to be debated, They're to be silenced. I remember it. And the notion was so absurd that opponents began to kind of use it against them. Today, people don't like to be called politically correct. But I'm here to tell you, they're the ones that came up with that phrase. And it just drips with arrogance, sure. But the thing is, that mindset had moved itself from political issues then as well into religious studies, particularly in colleges and universities. That's why at this point, liberals have really a kind of stranglehold on scholarship. I don't mean to say that there are no scholars who are conservative. There certainly are. But they're largely shunned, particularly when we're talking about issues like these early chapters of Genesis. I find it absurd, the idea that there are no conservative Bible scholars out there who could and are not, I should say, qualified to fill seats at places like Yale and Princeton, the University of Chicago, but it isn't happening, and it isn't happening on purpose. They don't want that discussion. Now, closely akin to this is the self-perpetuation of liberalism. What I mean by that is, and really I probably could have combined these two areas into one, but I'll discuss them separately. The idea is, if all you ever hear are liberal theories about the Bible, if all you have ever known is that the Bible is not authentic, that it's a collection of stories and legends and doesn't really, in Genesis, doesn't have anything to do with a man named Moses. There might have been somebody had to write it at some point, but it was some guy with an agenda, and he only talked about inspiration because that gave authority and credence to the claims he was writing down. If that's all you have ever heard, it's unlikely that you'll reject that, and it's entirely possible, and in fact likely, that we have PhDs who have never even been confronted with the authenticity of the Bible. And so they have gone through to the terminal degree, never really even considered a conservative point of view, and guess who then, when the university retools, when people die off or retire, then they have these self-perpetuated liberals again in those same places. The situation, as I've described, has been happening for many, many years. I'm of the opinion that in the last few years it has changed a little bit in this respect. For many years it's been a disconnect between the hierarchies of the denominations, in many cases the so-called pastors of those churches, and the people in the pews. What do you mean? I mean, generally speaking, the people in the pews of denominations didn't agree with their councils and hierarchies. In many cases, they didn't even know what those hierarchies, councils were teaching. Okay? What do you mean by that? I mean, and many of you will remember this, wasn't that long ago when you could talk to someone of virtually any denomination, and if you were to say to that person, do you believe the Bible? He'd say yes, and he meant it. Now, if you were to pin his so-called pastor down, maybe he didn't. But the guy in the pew did. And I want to talk to you about what's happened with that disconnect, because it has changed recently. What's happened is disbelief, because of the unprecedented and unrelenting attack on the early chapters of Genesis. I'm of the opinion that that doubt in the validity of God's Word has finally filtered its way down to the rank and file. Now, it hasn't hit everybody, and there are people, and I know some people who found the Lord's church simply because their own denomination in their minds went crazy. And they started saying there's got to be a church out there that still believes the Bible. There's probably an opportunity for people like us who do still believe the Bible with people like that. And I tried to take advantage of that incidentally a couple of weeks ago on my radio program. I don't know if you all heard about this, but there's been a controversy in Toledo, Ohio, because the Central United Methodist Church, you hear about this, Gene, in Toledo, Ohio, puts up a billboard that said being gay is a gift from God. And so a controversy erupted because another local denominational church took exception to that and put up their own billboards. And so a billboard fight then proceeded, which I find kind of amusing. But anyway, there's a fellow in Parkersburg who wrote a letter to the editor, and he's the so-called pastor of a local United Methodist church, saying that's the best thing in the world, and we need to give out a message of, how was it he put it? Acceptance, basically acceptance without any change. Okay? So I asked a series of questions on my radio program. I mean, the man's name was in the paper. I don't think I was being unkind or unfair. And I directed my comments to the members of that church. And I said, I think you need to ask some questions. I think you need to ask, number one, what else is it? Could you tell us the other topics about which you're right and the Bible's wrong? Number two, what other sins are you prepared to accept besides this one? Number three, I actually used up in the next week, and it seems absurd, but it's logical. I said, if no change is necessary to become a member of your church, what if I'm a nudist? He's the one who said it, not me. I'm guessing they make them put on clothes. But who knows? I said, what if I'm an adulterer? And again, I may have crossed the line here, but I think I said, oh, and what if it's your wife he's involved with? Does he have to change, or can he keep that up? He's the one who said it, not me. The point I'm making is this. There is an opportunity, I think, with decent people to say, look what this has become around you. Why? Because you have doubted the authenticity of the Bible, and your leadership has for years. Now, the reason that not everybody is leaving those congregations is not quite so, there's no upside to this as far as I'm concerned, and that is that ordinary people today, I think, have less trust in the validity of the Bible than they ever have. Why? Well, it's not really because of the evidence that's been presented to them. I'm confident that it's because it's the quaint morality of the Bible that's the problem. They didn't take a look at the evidence and say, you know, according to the evidence as I have viewed it, there's nothing to these theories that have been presented about the Bible. No, what's happening is the way that they're living means that they can't afford to believe the Bible. That's the problem. And so now, as they have been confronted with these ideas, they've decided, you know, maybe there's something to this, because God is telling me some things that I don't want to hear. So if this book isn't really the Bible, that's a message that I can grab a hold of. You know, we usually think of atheism begetting immorality, but we also need to remember that, as Paul points out in Romans chapter 1, that works the other way as well. And so again, there are many people that simply can't afford to believe the Bible based on how they're living. That's why it's come down that way. Romans chapter 1, verse 28, Paul mentions this principle, I believe, when he says, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them up to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. That's, I think, a fair assessment of our generation. I want to skip ahead a little bit, though, and begin to talk to you as we reflect on our generation and the direction it's gone, and our opinions about the validity of the text of the Bible, by making this observation. It wasn't always that way. Only 43 years ago. Only 43 years ago, something happened. Now, I'm going to tell you this, and you're going to have to listen to this again, because Brother Miller told the same story yesterday. And when he did it, I thought, oh no, I don't know anything else to do at this point. So you're just going to have to listen to it again if you heard it before. At that point, this would have been the most watched event on television in history. December the 24th, 1968. At that point, mankind was at the very cusp of achieving what might still be considered the greatest human achievement ever, and that's the moon landing. This was not the moon landing. That would come a year later, or not quite a year, but anyway. Astronauts Anders, Lovell, and Borman are actually orbiting the moon at this point. They are farther away from home than anybody has ever been. 250,000 miles away. They've traveled through space at speeds exceeding tens of thousands of miles. They have had their rendezvous calculated to a razor's edge on computers that, well, the most powerful computer they had in 1968 won't touch the one that many of you have in your pocket. And the mathematics required for hitting that target, someone once compared it to shooting one single raindrop with a bow and arrow at 200 yards at midnight in a rainstorm. Slightest miscalculation, there would be no going home. The picture you're about to see is the actual picture from the video that they took. Andy, could you play that audio, please? In case you're wondering, we've had nothing but trouble.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day.
God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on this good earth.
I wanted you to hear that. I know it's rough. I know it's staticky. I was not really old enough to have an appreciation of this event when it took place. I get choked up listening to that today for a couple of reasons. One is imagining what it would have been like to have been at that point, seeing a view that no one but God had ever seen before. and reflecting on all the training that the very best of the very best had gone through, and all the sacrifices that they had made to get to that point. And then when they get there, and the picture that you see here is the actual video from the audio. You can find it online, you can watch it, although the scene doesn't change much. The still is about as good as the video. You get to that point, what do? Do you reflect on your own greatness, your own achievement? These men chose rather to say, there's nothing to say except in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I get a little choked up over it as well, thinking about the difference in my world and that one. Because it's hard to imagine one of the shuttle astronauts doing anything like this. In fact, the doors started to close that very year. The infamous Madalyn Murray O'Hair filed suit in a Houston court because of this Bible reading. The judge threw the suit out, saying he had no jurisdiction over what happened on the moon. But the political pressure was enough that it changed Buzz Aldrin's plans to partake of communion on the moon and read from John 15. He did both of those things, but bowed to the pressure and read silently. This has been a lengthy introduction. An introduction, now you're worried, aren't you, G? It's been a lengthy introduction, but the purpose of it has been to say, here's where we are. The specifics won't be that long. We're going to talk about 3 attacks on these early chapters of Genesis. Beginning with the attack on creation itself, special creation, 6 days of creation. We don't have time to talk about everything that we probably should talk about, but I want to discuss with you the notion of attacking the special creation as it's done by the atheists. Now, the truth is, as we discuss this attack, there's not a lot that we can say. Why? Because there's very little middle ground. I mean, the atheist starts out with the point of view that I know there is no God, and therefore nothing I read about in the Bible is correct. He's borrowing mostly, as he analyzes the Bible, from liberals and skeptics, and we'll talk about some of their theories in a moment. But I want to at least acquaint you with this principle. When you're listening to today's crop of militant atheists, do not expect to hear clear and concise and well thought out philosophical arguments. What they have learned is it's much more effective for them to be experts at elocution rather than proof. That is, they seem to feel that by making a statement, they've proved a point. Dawkins, of course, being the most infamous of these, but in my judgment, for whatever it's worth, I think Sam Harris is probably the worst of the offenders. I want to show you a series of quotes from Sam Harris, again, one of the big 3, I guess you'd say, along those 2 with Hitchens. But these are provocative statements, they are slogans, they are utterly devoid of good sense, but people are believing this, they're working with this. There are 5 of these quotes. Number 1, theology, he says, is ignorance with wings. I couldn't find this one, but I know I have read at one point or another his statement, theology, or maybe Christianity, he may have said, is ignorance set to good music. Interesting. He also, in some of these, you can see the preface, like the first 3 words, that it's kind of an arrogant point of view that he comes to you from. For instance, this one about the nature of God. At this moment, or we know enough at this moment. We know enough at this moment. It's a very full of himself statement, but he says that the God of the Bible is not worthy, not only the immensity of creation, he's unworthy of a man. And it's time that's the next, it's time that we owned up to it's time that we admitted that, how was it he put it, that faith is just the excuse people have to keep believing when their reasons fail. And then there's this one, that the Bible and the Quran, I'm not sure I even like how this one starts, get almost every significant fact about us and our world wrong. Really. Notice he doesn't cite any, that's not the point. Notice he doesn't want to argue the point, that's not the point. He just wants to get that out. That's something people can put on a sign and march behind. The last one I think that you'll find most objectionable, and it kind of displays a level of ignorance that most of us find semi-amusing if the subject matter were not what it was. When he says, could there be any doubt that the Jews would seek to harm the Son of God again, knowing that his body is now in the form of a defenseless cracker? And somebody thought that was brilliant. Well, obviously I'm not that somebody. But nonetheless, these are the kinds of things that are being stated from the atheist's point of view. Now, as I said a moment ago, he borrows much of his material from the liberals and skeptics. And because of time, we're not going to talk a lot about this. Why? I don't know what can be said much about somebody who approaches the Bible in the early chapters of Genesis with the idea, I know there's no God, so therefore there is no Bible. If you start with that assumption, there's not really much point in talking about evidence, is there? I'd rather spend a little bit of time talking about, in general, the evolutionary attacks on the early chapters of Genesis. Evolutionists, of course, are not all atheists. There are many who consider themselves to be theistic evolutionists. They believe in God. They also believe in evolution. What's been interesting about this is that that group has moved from those that we would consider to be liberals in some cases to today being more, in many cases, I don't mean to say that the liberals and skeptics are not evolutionists, but more and more evangelicals and even fundamentalist groups are espousing, at least some individuals, evolution, including some in churches of Christ. Now, to give you an illustration of this principle, a few years ago I became familiar with Dr. Carl Giberson. Giberson is a strident evolutionist. He's also a member of the Church of the Nazarene. Now, the Church of the Nazarene is not the Church of our Lord. I want to make that clear, but by the same token, I don't think anybody considers the Church of the Nazarene a liberal group. They're not. They're quite conservative. I'm talking about their theology, the way they're thinking about the Bible. But here is a very, very well-known evolutionist. Well, how do you get to that point where you're a member of the Church of the Nazarene and you're also an evolutionist? Well, you have to have some compromises, don't you? Here's what's interesting about the compromises that people make between the Bible and what evolution teaches. It's all one-sided. Have you ever noticed that? It's all one-sided. In their view, the Bible is elastic and plastic enough to fit whatever the theory du jour is. Day age, sure, I can make it fit that. Gap, whatever gap theory you want, there's several. Yeah, I can make it fit that. How about if I have God creating an entire world and then destroying it, start it over? Yeah, I can make it fit that. And you can if you don't care how you treat the Bible. The Bible, in their minds, is always able to accommodate. There's no compromise on the other side. It's all the Bible that's supposed to compromise. Well, how do you get it to do that? Well, you say to people, you have misinterpreted the Bible. You didn't understand that the Bible in Genesis 1 and 2 is speaking poetically. Oh, good. Here's the problem with that. I've read it, and it isn't. It just isn't. I don't know any other way to tell somebody. It's not poetry. I've read poetry. It's not poetry. Now, you can tell me you don't believe it. Sure, don't tell me it's poetry. In their minds, you can always change your understanding of the Bible to fit what you want it to be. And again, you can do that. But you won't leave the Bible intact when you do that. It's not poetry. Now, I want to move ahead. Again, on account of time, I want to move ahead and get to what might be the root of this and where all of this is emanating from, and that's the various liberal and skeptic views of these first chapters of Genesis. Where did all these come from? Well, as Lloyd Bailey pointed out, this viewpoint of Genesis has been the model of scholarship for over 200 years, and he wrote that over 20 years ago. Where did it come from? Well, the liberals tell us that we now know that the Bible, in essence, is a fraud. We know that there never was really a guy named Moses, and if there were, he was not the guy who wrote this. Some other people added to it and wrote as it went along. In the 19th, and this has been going on for a long time, in his introduction to the Old Testament, Harrison points out that the seeds of this probably go back as far as the 1600s, maybe even farther. And you can follow the progression, most of these German scholars, but it reached a crescendo of liberalism in the 19th century. And the theory, I want to acquaint some of you with it. Many of you have at least heard these words, but I want to at least let you know what they think that the Bible is. It's known by several theories. It's known as the Graf-Wellhausen theory. It's known as the documentary hypothesis. Usually, it's sometimes called the redaction theory. And if you want to know what redaction means, it's just a big word that means editing. So it's an editing theory of Genesis. Well, all these people who claim they know that the Bible isn't real, that you've seen on television, where are they getting that from? They're getting it from this theory. And the theory says that Moses, if he ever existed at all, don't even worry about Moses, that Genesis, not to mention the rest of the Pentateuch, it was written by 4 groups of people. Now, these 4 groups of people, one group we identify because they like to use the word Yahweh or Jehovah, so they're J. Some of them like to use the word Elohim, so they're E. And then you have those that came along and wrote most of the book of Deuteronomy, they're D. And then we have some priests in the post-exilic period, and I want to emphasize that in case you fell asleep, nodded off. I said post-exilic period. That means 500 and later. That means Genesis, much of it wasn't written 1500, it was written in 400. Everybody got that? That's huge. If you didn't know that, that's what they're saying. And so you ask, how did you come to that conclusion? It's all subjective. Every bit of it. They look at a piece of Scripture and they say, oh, he used Yahweh. That can't be the same guy that used Elohim, because as we all know, sarcasm warning, as we all know, one single person can't use both words, Yahweh and Elohim. Can he just now 3 seconds ago? Nonsense. Nonsense. Thinking people would throw this out in a heartbeat if they knew the specifics about it. It's all subjective. It's worse than that. Brother Kaufman pointed out, let's go ahead and skip the Toledoth. I'm going to come back to that. Let's get to Kaufman's quote. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever. Here's the problem. They talk about prior documents. Guess how many they have? As Kaufman points out, not only do they not have any documents, they don't even have a shred of a document. They don't even have a letter out of a word of a document. But you go to the most prestigious universities in this country, and I'm here to tell you, every single one of their scholars will tell you this is the fact. Based on what? Based on nothing at all. That's what they've destroyed America's faith in Genesis with smoke and mirrors. They got nothing. Literally nothing. Now, they have this theory that the Bible was thus constructed, particularly Genesis. Really, it goes to the rest of the Bible as well. But because of time, I'd like to talk about this more, but I don't have time. Let's talk about some similar principles with the deluge. I know I'm keeping Andy hopping, who's helping me out because I'm skipping, but I've got to. All right, now, when you get to the deluge, again, this is under attack for many of the same reasons. The same principles, in fact, are in play. What principles? Well, again, it's the idea that there's a grain of truth in this story, but though the story might be important in some cases, it doesn't have to even be true in order to be important. Well, what about the flood? Well, it's an exaggeration, we're told. What do you mean it's an exaggeration? I mean, something might have happened sometime, but I can't prove that anything really happened, and certainly not a universal flood. Now, like special creation, like Genesis in general, this has undergone an erosion of belief. That is, once upon a time, the general public believed that the world was covered in water. From another standpoint, that is from a geological one, once upon a time, the world's geologists basically factored the flood into their thinking. That obviously is no longer the case. Now, was the flood universal, might be the question. Well, again, some people say, no, the Bible's obviously mistaken, or they might even say that it's poetry, even as they charge the first chapters with being poetry as well. One of the reasons that people have for rejecting the flood is that they don't have any parallels. It's a singular event. They say nothing like that's happened since. Well, duh, that's exactly what God said about it. In fact, had there been another one, the Bible would have been proved wrong. God said this is a one-time thing. I've always found it interesting, even when I was a very young man, that nobody seems to have any trouble with the idea that the earth was once covered with water so long as that water was frozen. Have you ever thought about that? I find that odd. I'm of the opinion that if the flood were not in the Bible, everybody on earth would believe in the flood. But that's just me. Now, is it important that we accept a worldwide flood? Well, inspired writers believed it. In 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 5, Peter says that God brought the flood in on the world of the ungodly. I don't know what he could have said to have stated it so that we would accept his testimony on a worldwide flood. It is alluded to, obviously, in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20, which sometimes were disobedient when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. Jesus talked about it. Now, in Matthew chapter 24, if it were not a reality, it seems that all these people are mistaken. It seems that Peter was mistaken. Incidentally, Isaiah references the flood as well. And all of them were mistaken, if that's the case. Well, what's the evidence of a worldwide flood? Now, again, the principles of the charges have come from those that I've already mentioned, along with some others that I didn't have time to mention. But what's the evidence? I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. The evidence of a worldwide flood is, number one, the existence of the ark. There's no sense in making an ark if the flood's not worldwide. The worst place you can be in a flood is in a boat, if there's any higher ground. Number two, the wealth of flood stories and legends. Now, we are not reducing the Bible deluge of Genesis 6 through 9 to the status of a legend or a story. Nonetheless, these legends and stories had to come from somewhere, and there certainly are striking parallels between the better-known ones like the Gilgamesh epic and the Atrahasis epic and some other lesser-known ones, although, again, there are differences. Gilgamesh epic, for instance, they built a not particularly seaworthy cube. But even that contrast ought to tell you something. The one is definitely superior. Now, Isaac Asimov, and I cited him, didn't have time to talk about him earlier, but I cited him as an example of a previous generation's attitude toward the Bible, even though he comes to it from a very skeptical point of view. In fact, he was a strident atheist, and yet spoke in respectful terms of the Bible in general, in terms that would, I think I said in the lecture, you can't imagine Richard Dawkins saying what he said without choking on the words. But he missed it here. He had this attitude, well, I don't read anything about it in Egypt's records. Well, there are a lot of things you don't read about in Egypt's records. And I personally don't put a great deal of faith in the chronicles of kings who thought they were God. I think that just might have skewed their credibility just a little. But nonetheless, those ideas do exist. That is, around the world, that something happened at this time. And then, of course, for the Bible believer, there's the idea that God said in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 11, no more would a thing like this happen. And if this were a local flood, God's lied many, many times. We want to very quickly and very briefly discuss the attacks even on Genesis chapters 10 and 11, where two of the Toledoths are found. Now, earlier I said we'd mentioned this word Toledoth. It's found throughout these early chapters. In fact, Genesis, the entire book, is set up in a series of 10 Toledoths, which are translated either generation or genealogy. And it is a self-contained story that is described as the generation of something. Now, people will tell you that Genesis 2 and Genesis 1 contradict each other, and if they say that, they're demonstrating their utter ignorance of the Toledoth. And even if they didn't know about it, to provide more details is no contradiction anyway. But when we get to this point, some of the later Toledoths come into play. The Toledoth of Shem and the Toledoth of Terah, the father of Abraham. So at this point, we've got the division of the world. Well, why is that important? Well, some people say, well, we've got contradictions here. As Brother Kaufman pointed out in his commentary, how can you have something contradicting nothing because they don't have anything, and yet they're telling us this one's wrong? You can't have something that contradicts nothing. But anyway, so God is describing in Genesis chapters 10 and 11 the division of the earth, and this comes from the various families that descended from Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Most of those families became nations that are still identifiable today. And many of these nations come under the heading of what we call eponyms. An eponym, it simply means that the father gives his name to the nation. The student of the Bible is familiar with one such, Israel. Israel derived its name from Jacob or Israel. The problem is that many of these skeptics look at this and they say, well, we know that this is like Rome. Now, I'm not here to tell you I know there was no Romulus. I'm fairly confident that a wolf did not nurse him and his brother. But there might have been a Romulus, but many of the things that we know or that we are told about him are obviously mythological. And so what they're doing is they're saying, this is true then also of Abraham. Now, while these families are spreading out after the flood, we have some that are very noteworthy so far as the world is concerned. We have the father of Assyria, Ashur, people like that. But the Bible doesn't focus on them. Instead, it goes down to the Toledoth of Shem and begins to focus on this family, and then particularly on the Toledoth or generation of Terah. Why? Because God is ready to focus on this particular family, which leads us to this question: was there an Abraham? Some say no. They say there were two cults in Canaan. There was an Abraham worshiping cult and there was an Isaac worshiping cult, and they decided to get together, so they made one the son, the other the father. Wild, isn't it? Wonder where they got their evidence. Don't have any. They just say it and we're supposed to believe it. Archer pointed out a number of things that seem to verify the Bible record. The excavation of Ur, the fact that Abram was a common name in that area at that time, the fact that the Jordan Valley and Bethel and Shechem were all inhabited places also at this time. He even goes so far as to point out that Genesis 14 verse 1 has been verified. Many of the properties, the tribal customs of that day, those were verified as well. And that Abraham's own customs have also been verified. Now, have we proved it? No. Not to the satisfaction of some people. I want to suggest to you that the questions that we've raised today will continue to be asked almost certainly until the Lord comes back. I want to close with an affirmation that probably would not have much of an impact on anybody but a Bible believer, but I hope it'll have an impact on you. And that is, when we consider all of these things, all these attacks, why is it important that we do believe? Well, the obvious answer is, if we can't trust God when He told us about these things, we can't trust Jesus when He said, "He that believes and is baptized shall be saved." We can't trust Him when He said He was the Son of God. We can't trust Him when He said God so loved the world. We can't trust any of those things. But what I hope will have an impact on you is to observe the difference between what we have heard that they have claimed about these early chapters of Genesis and what we have read in the Scriptures about its setting. To me, the setting of the writing of Genesis is perhaps one of the most powerful things about it. Because Genesis, in essence, you can say, is split up into two parts. The first part being the antediluvian world, including creation. And the second part, and most of the book, the family of Abraham. What was the message? What was the impact? I'm here to tell you, I believe that it's important to understand that Genesis was written to recently freed slaves. God had a message for them. You're not beasts of burden. You're my sons. And on top of that, you're descendants of the great man Abraham. Lift your heads up. You're no longer slaves. You're no longer animals. I don't think that message is worthwhile if it's not true. What's the impact of the book of Genesis for you today? I'm here to tell you, I think it's the same thing. You read that and you come to understand that we really are special, made in the image of God. And according to Romans chapter 4, we continue to be those who call Abraham our father in the faith. We have a heritage from God and a heritage of faith from our predecessors. I want to encourage you, don't let anyone cheat you out of it.